Going to start. I think we are ready to start. So welcome everyone, happy Friday, and welcome to this session called Discovering the Iliad's Fluid Life as an Oral Poem. I'm Catherine McKay. I'm the Director of Gift Planning at Holy Cross. And in that role, I oversee the 1843 Legacy Society, which is hosting today's webinar. I'd like to welcome the chairman of our classics department, Professor Neel Smith, and his 4 talented students, as you will soon come to learn. We have rising seniors, Natalie DiMattia, we have Augusta Holyfield, Anne Catherine Schaaf, and rising junior, Rose Kaczmarek. Take it away, Professor Smith.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us here. Much as I wish we were on College Hill together, I appreciate the opportunity to share some of our work with the Iliad with you, whether you're taking a lunch break on the East Coast or maybe having a late breakfast on the West Coast or pausing for dinner in Europe. It's great to see all of you. You know I'm a classicist because I'm going to address the huge question of the transmission of the Iliad by trying to read 4 lines with you. So that's going to be our undertaking today. Some of you may already have read or at least seen reviews of a new book by Robert Canigal, a bright biography of the scholar Milman Parry. It's on my summer reading list. I've read reviews, haven't read it yet, but it's subtitled Brief Life and Big Idea is enticing. And I will just say that if you have read it, I'm eager to hear from you, but the big idea of Milman Parry for our purposes, I'll summarize as there was never one Iliad. And that's what I want to explore by reading 4 lines of the poem with you. I'd like to take 2 pairs of lines. I want to look at 2 lines in Iliad 22 and use them to think about how the oral tradition of this poem is able to preserve language for centuries and even millennia. And then I want to look at 2 lines in Iliad 24 that illustrate how in the performance tradition, multiformity is an inherent part of it. The Iliad could always be performed more than one way. And sometimes even the tiniest difference can have a real impact in how we understand the poem. And so I'll start with Iliad 22. Iliad 22 brings us to the dramatic high point of the death of Hector. Achilles has spent most of the Iliad sulking in his tent, angry that his honor has been offended, until the killing by Hector of his friend Patroclus. Achilles returns in rage to the battlefield, and at this climactic moment slays Hector in a very dramatic kind of speech between the 2 of them. Hector asks for mercy and then recognizes Achilles is like an animal. He'll never have mercy, in the same way that lions and humans don't have treaties. Achilles is never going to have mercy on Hector, his victim. And the 2 lines that wrap this up, roughly translated, his soul fled from his limbs and went to Hades, mourning his fate when it left his manhood and youth. And I want to look in particular at this word I've translated loosely, manhood, or in Greek, androteta. It's a problem. It's a problem because it doesn't scan. This is an oral poem. It can't be performed out of meter. Every expression in this poem fits in dactylic hexameter. Normally, if we tried to scan this word, we would get a long, short pattern, which is not possible in dactylic hexameter. It has to be short, long, short, androteta. And the answer to this problem lies in the etymology. This consonant cluster that normally creates a long syllable in Greek meter rules, in fact, goes back to an earlier form that didn't have this long cluster of syllables. To make this technical point very briefly, this line must have been formed before the Late Bronze Age. We have Bronze Age tablets preserving names like Alexander. Alexandros has the same root as this word for manhood. And this shift in sound to this consonant cluster has already happened. So the lines we are reading in Iliad 22 were already being sung this way before the Late Bronze Age. If we want to think in rough chronological terms, already by 1500 or maybe even 2000 BCE, these lines were formed in the metrical shape that we know them today. And a third perspective on this pair of lines is that we find precisely the same pair in Iliad 16 at the death of Patroclus. When Hector slays Patroclus, Achilles' friend, in Achilles' armor, we have the same two lines about his soul, here referring to Patroclus, fled from his limbs, went to Hades, mourning his fate when it left his manhood and youth. So there's a beautiful thematic parallel between these two moments that is kind of brought into the foreground by the formulaic usage of precisely this same perfectly expressed idea, expressed exactly the same way since the Middle Bronze Age or earlier. So we see in this one of the key aspects of oral performance. The traditional language can persist for millennia. Language shaped to the form of a dactylic hexameter can roll off the tongue of these poets in the same form century after century. And yet, there's a second essential feature of this oral tradition, and that is that no two performances are identical. That is the main thrust of the research of Milman Parry and his collaborator, Albert Lord. Parry was a scholar of Homeric poetry. He studied in particular the use of repeated phrases, the so-called formulaic epithets, white-armed Hera, swift-footed Achilles, all of those kind of familiar repeated phrases. He knew that in some sense they were the product of oral tradition. But like all of us who work in libraries, he didn't really know what that meant. So he learned Serbo-Croatian, traveled to Yugoslavia, and studied living oral poets. And together with Albert Lord, recorded, interviewed, learned how they worked. And one brief summary of their crucial findings that are really the beginning of all study of oral poetry since then is that performance and composition are two aspects of the same act. As the poet is singing, the poet is performing. The only way, as the poet is performing, the poet is composing. The only way the poet can compose is to perform. They are inseparable, and no two performances are identical. It's like telling a story. If I told you a story about the time I was able to travel to Venice and look at a manuscript, I might tell you the same events every time. But if you recorded me word for word, they wouldn't be identical tellings. And I might stretch out some details a little more if you were really interested, or if we're pressed for time, I might shorten the story. That's the way that these oral poets work. And that's the language and the performance tradition that lie, the kind of language and performance tradition that lie behind our Iliad. So one of the crucial questions for us is, how do we get from a tradition of oral performance to our written texts of the Iliad? And that's a complicated and long story. I'm just going to pick out a couple of high points in very, very broad strokes. As we saw in that first example from Iliad 22, by 1500 or even earlier BCE, we can be certain that this tradition is already performing songs about these kinds of themes. By the 6th century, if not earlier, people are beginning to write down versions of the Iliad, but it's only in a little more than 2,000 years ago that scholars, particularly at the Library of Alexandria, begin to address the problem of trying to create comparative or critical editions. So in the 3rd, 2nd century, 1st century BCE, these great scholars are comparing the many different Iliads they found and trying to create one. But of course, we don't have their works. We only have much later references to them in manuscripts that only date to about 1,000 years ago. And we only get regularly reproduced texts, Greek texts of the Iliad, with the invention of printing, movable type printing about 500 years ago. And only about 250 years ago was a crucial manuscript first published. The Venice manuscript is the oldest manuscript of the Iliad and is particularly important because of the notes in it that reflect the work of the scholars at the Library of Alexandria, notes we call Scolia. I'll turn to that manuscript in just a moment, but the footnote I want to add is that only in 2018 did we have the first complete edition of that manuscript done digitally. Largely, more than 90% of the contributors were undergraduates, and I can say to this audience, primarily undergraduates of the College of the Holy Cross. When we think about transmission of manuscripts, we usually imagine something like a family tree, a single original. Over time, variation creeps in as copyists introduce new forms or make mistakes. So here's an example from the historian Herodotus. A, B, and C, D, R, S, and V, along the bottom of the screen are manuscripts of the text of Herodotus. We compare them, reconstruct them in families. So A, B, and C kind of go together in an A family. R, S, and V to go together in an R family. We look at the variations and we try to reconstruct an original X that in this case would be what Herodotus actually wrote, the one original source. But when we look at the Iliad, we see exactly the opposite phenomenon. Normally we expect transmission will introduce variation. In the case of the Iliad, transmission reduces variation. The earlier we look, the more variety we find. So our manuscripts from 1,000 years ago are relatively uniform. If we look earlier in time at the evidence of papyri, we see more variety. And the earlier the sources, the more the variety we see. This fits perfectly, of course, with Perry and Lord's understanding of the way oral poets work. There never was one Iliad. We have tried to create one from the many Iliads that were recorded over time out of this tradition of oral performance. This is where I want to introduce a Greek term, scholia, that essentially means just scholarly footnotes. In our earliest manuscripts, like the one illustrated here, they can fill the margins. And in this illustration, the red boxes are lines of the Iliad. All the other colored boxes are scholia. Many of them include comments that derive from or quote scholars from the Library of Alexandria whose works no longer exist, but who were studying in the 3rd and 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the different versions of the Iliad, and even quoting versions of the Iliad that no longer exist in our manuscript sources. So the multiformity of this tradition that we no longer have in our manuscripts is reflected to a greater degree in these footnotes. Then that's why they are so important for Homerus. That's why I was fortunate to be part of a team that went to Venice in 2007 to photograph this manuscript, the oldest complete manuscript of the Iliad, known as the Venetus A, particularly important because of the unique set of thousands and thousands of these scholia preserved in it. It includes material comments that don't exist in any other manuscript. It's housed today in St. Mark's Library, right in St. Mark's Square in Venice, this beautiful Renaissance library. And the sunny plaza, however, is not where we were working. We did our work in a kind of grim little converted closet where we assembled this contraption that had to be floated in piece by piece on gondolas and then kind of built in situ, put together in this little spot. But the result was we got this high resolution photography of the manuscript illustrated on the left-hand side, the kind of high resolution photography that we can work from now anytime we have access to the internet. The scholia present their own challenge, however. Just as the Iliad didn't start from a single source and then introduce variation because of mistakes in copying, and therefore we can't think of it as just a kind of schematic family tree kind of transmission. The scholia can draw on multiple sources. They're recomposed every time. A colleague of mine compares it to referring to the scholia as talking about, say, Gray's Anatomy. And I don't mean the TV show. I mean the anatomical work that first appeared something like 1818. You could go to Amazon today and buy Gray's Anatomy. It will not be the same book that you would have purchased in 1818. It'll have the same title. And for now on sale, under $200, what a deal, you can get the 42nd edition of Gray's Anatomy. There'll be some similarity. There might even be some identical pieces, but we have to be more nuanced than just saying the scholia in the same way we have to be careful about saying Gray's Anatomy. No. So that brings us to the problem I want to share with you and invite my colleagues to inform you a little more about how Happy Iliad and these commentaries in the Scolia reached us. That's the work that Natalie, Augusta, Rose, and Catherine have been addressing both last summer and this summer. And I'll turn it over to them now to tell you about some of their work. Natalie, would you like to pick up?
Yeah. So as Professor Smith mentioned, this summer we're attempting to understand the transmission of the Scolia. But in order to do that, we have to develop a toolkit of methods of analysis in order to do that work. And so we started in 2020 to define our methods of analysis and practice those skills so that we would be able to apply them this summer. In the spring of 2020, myself, Augusta, and Catherine developed a proposal for the Weiss Summer Research Program that aimed to look at the text of the Iliad through biological methods and algorithms. That proposal was accepted. The Weiss Summer Research Program was canceled due to COVID, and we had to resubmit a proposal to work as summer research associates on a part-time schedule. So our 40 hours a week was downshifted to 20 hours a week, and we had to refocus the planned program of that summer. What we ended up doing was working with Professor Smith and Professor Karen Ober of the biology department. We looked at the text of the Iliad poem, the words and characters of the poem as the poem's genes or the poem's DNA. Classicists and biologists have a very long history of similarity because classicists have been using evolutionary trees to describe the transmission of texts and cultural artifacts for as long as, or even maybe longer, if I can say that, than biologists have when they're looking at organisms. So we share a lot of the same methods, but biologists have really pushed the boat out in terms of the software and algorithms available to do that work. So we were using a software called POP, which deals in parsimony, to develop this unrooted network of relationships between the Iliad texts available in different manuscripts that you see in front of you. The network doesn't have a single source because, as Professor Smith discussed, there is no single source of the Iliad, and instead describes the relationships of distance between the contents of the poem. So the Venice A, which Professor Smith was just discussing, is quite different in the contents of its text than the Upsilon 1-1 and the Venice B, a pair of 11th century manuscripts that we tend to call the twins because they are so very similar. And the twins are more similar to Allen's critical edition, a turn of the century reconstruction of the text, than they are to the Venice A. So we developed this method of analysis and practiced these tools, which allowed us to prepare ourselves for our upcoming research with Scolia in the summer of 2021.
But at the end of last summer, we were just beginning to sort of dip our fingers into these methods of analysis for the Scolia. The Scolia are a totally different text than the Iliad, and because of that, they represent information in different ways. They use language in different ways, and so we can't use the same methods of analysis for the Iliad text that we do for the Scolia. So we did just some initial topic modeling, topic modeling is a standard natural language process method that finds reoccurring patterns of co-occurring terms. So here you can see just one of the clusters that we got out of our computational method that we were able to identify as being about editorial criticism. So essentially, this is a topic of words that is Aristarchus and Xenodotus, who are two of these grammarians and commenters who are just arguing. They're arguing about which lines are real Homer, what word should be there, is this, the correct punctuation. They're arguing about editorial and grammar decisions. And this was just a very initial result. We were just beginning to scratch the surface of how we could think about differences within the Scolia. And so we took that excitement and that interest and all those questions that we were beginning to think of and brought those into our application for this summer. And we were luckily funded to continue to think about these questions. And so this summer, we're really focusing in on how we can create the kind of network and understanding for the Scolia that we were able to do last summer with the Iliad text.
All right, thank you, Augusta. So as Augusta was saying, the 2020 summer research team creatively combined a variety of techniques to create this unrooted network model for transmission of the Iliad. And that model accounts for the oral tradition origins of the text and its non-linear evolution. Yet, because the Scolia are creatively modified through transmission, they require a different model than the Iliad text, which has become more normalized over time and follows a set pattern. Previous work has illustrated that common units of the Scolia are identifiable across manuscripts. The medieval scholiasts drew on a number of commentary sources when they were writing, so common themes and phrases stand out in the Scolia of the available manuscripts. However, Scolia transmission is a creative process, so these units have been compressed, expanded, and combined in different manuscripts. This summer, we plan to explore forms of analysis like topic modeling and word vectors to identify and trace the path of these Scolia units through the manuscripts. Our previous scholarly research has focused on the uniqueness and the differences apparent in the different manuscripts. But our project now is going to explore the similarities that have emerged over centuries of evolution.
And I will give you one example. So the images on this slide are of each of the first Scolia of Book 8 in the 4 manuscripts we're looking at as a team. We first read these Scolia this past Tuesday. Though these are not identical comments, they do each touch on the differences between saffron-gowned dawn versus rosy-fingered dawn. We've already seen in the first page we read that some Scolia only exist in one manuscript and others exist across all 4 of these manuscripts. In short, this is what we're exploring this summer.
Yes, thank you, all 4 of you. A glimpse of the technically daunting, but I think very stimulating work that this team has just begun this summer. I want to step back for a moment, though, and ask now, why do we care about this work? What's the point of studying these Scolia and trying to understand the multiformity of the tradition? And to that end, I want to read the second pair of lines from the Iliad. I want to turn to Iliad 24, the end of the story. After the death of Hector in Iliad 22, and Achilles' abuse of the body and dragging Hector's body around the walls of Troy 3 times. Iliad 23 is primarily devoted to the funeral games that then celebrate the life of Patroclus. But the Iliad doesn't end with the death of Hector, and it doesn't end with the honoring of Patroclus in the funeral games. In Iliad 24, the aged Priam, Hector's father, sort of miraculously, with Hermes' help, makes his way at night past the sentries to the tent of Achilles. And there he meets with Achilles, kisses the hands of the man who killed his son, asks for his mercy, asks for permission to take Hector's abused body back to Troy for burial. Achilles sees Priam and thinks of his own father, whom he knows he will never see again. Achilles knows he's fated to die at Troy. And they weep together for what they both lost. In the course of that night, Hermes warns Hector that he should probably, warns Priam that he should probably make his way back to Troy before anyone else sees him, even though Achilles has promised that the Trojans can have all the time they want to bury Hector properly, that Achilles will enforce a truce. Priam gets up with his groom, loads the body onto a cart, and they head back to Troy. The 2 lines I'd like to look at with you now are from book 24, lines 696 and 697. And roughly in English, they mean something like, with lamentation and wailing, they drove the horses into the city, and the mules brought the corpse. And it continues with the beginning of the next sentence, but I want to focus on this one sentence and its ending, the mules brought the corpse. Brought the corpse, nekun pheron in Greek. This is the Greek text in that critical edition by T.W. Allen, printed by Oxford Classical Press, one of the most widely, perhaps the most widely used Greek text of the Iliad today. If we turn to the Venice manuscript, we'll find that line on folio 324 verso. And at the top of the screen, you'll see the end of that line. The kind of brown smudge to the right is a little comment on the margin. It's very hard to read. But when we were in Venice doing the photography of this manuscript, we had the opportunity to do some selectively, to do some ultraviolet photography. Ultraviolet photography is not good for the manuscript. It's hard on the manuscript, but it can bring out text that's otherwise hard to read. So we tried to limit ourselves to only where it was necessary. I believe my colleague Mary Ebbett in the classics department here was the first person who noticed and read this small note next to line 697. The text of that little marginal note says graphatai pheron. That is, there is a reading, there's another reading, pheron. And in the main text of the Iliad, we have the verb agon. What we have here is an example of the Scolia preserving a multiform. This text could be performed two different ways, using either the verb pheron or the verb agon. Now, back when we read this sentence, the mules brought the corpse, we saw that the critical edition by Allen prints with the verb pheron. The scribe of the Venice used a different verb, agon, but has a note that says there are other manuscripts that say pheron. Now, the words don't sound anything alike. They don't look anything alike graphically. This is not a mistake of the scribe. This is not a miscopying. This is not a slip of the pen. This is a multiform. There were two different ways this line could be performed. They're metrically equivalent, but they use two different verbs. You might think at first, if you're in beginning Greek, oh, well, don't they mean the same thing? They both mean to bring. So it's okay, just he brought the corpse, or they brought the corpse. But they're not exactly equivalent. Pharaoh, the verb pharaoh means to bring something. Normally, it's an object, something inanimate. If I am going to the coffee shop and I bring my Greek textbook with me, I would use pharaoh to describe that. But if I'm going to the coffee shop and I bring my friend along with me, I would use ago. For a living accompaniment. Ago is a better verb. Pharaoh is better for the object. Which one do we choose here? The song was performed both ways. The song could be performed either way. That's the kind of multiform that we discover in these Scolia that in some cases we would have no evidence for otherwise in our manuscripts. I was thinking about that very line in 2013 when I was teaching fourth semester Greek. In Greek 214, we were reading the Iliad. And I was driving home from work on Friday, May the 3rd, thinking about what we should do in our last class. Friday the 6th of May was our last class that semester. This was a really wonderful group of students. And I was trying to decide what should we focus on in that final class. I was thinking about this passage of book 24 with that interesting multiform as I was driving towards my home in Worcester on Hammond Street. Traffic got backed up, was stopped. Usually this is my shortcut home. This is supposed to be the way I avoid traffic. I could see that there were TV trucks with cameras and the elevated, cameras shooting the scene, and there was a policeman directing traffic, one person at a time. Usually in Worcester, that means there's a 3-decker that's caught fire, but there was no smoke. And it was only when one by one, as the cars were fed through and I turned off of Hammond onto Main Street that I saw the reason for the slowdown. Graham Putnam and Mahoney's funeral parlor at the corner of Hammond Street and Main Street in Worcester is run by Peter Stephan. He's a man who, for many, many years, has made a point of burying at his own expense indigents or unknown people because of his conviction that every human being deserves a respectful burial. And so Peter Stephan was the only person in the state of Massachusetts who would take in the body of Tamerlane Tsarnaev, one of the Boston bombers. This was the scene outside of the funeral home that's right at that intersection. So I realized at that point that that was what we needed to read in class the last day. We had to read that passage with the decision whether we were going to read Ago or Pharaoh. It gave us a chance to think about the kinds of questions that the Iliad provokes. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be an enemy, even a deadly enemy in a war? Our Iliads, and I intentionally make that plural, allow us the choice in this passage in Book 24 to read either verb. T.W. Allen, the editor of the Oxford edition, looked at the manuscript evidence and made the judgment that they favored the reading Pharaoh. The tradition of the manuscripts argues that what the mules carried back to Troy was a cart of inert matter. The scribe of the Venice A manuscript knew an alternate performance tradition, a different way that you could sing the ending of this poem. And he preferred that. He put in the text agon. He was a good scholar, made his footnote, observed that there's also the reading Pharaoh, but he used agon. In the Venice A manuscript, what the mules brought back to Troy was the corpse of Homer, but still a human, though a corpse. It's almost a contradiction in terms to describe the word nekus with this, to use that as the object of this verb ago. They make Hector's corpse still something human. And in doing that, Achilles' choice to grant to Priam the burial of his son is an act that maintains Hector's humanity and also then restores Achilles' humanity, something that in the killing of Hector, we see Achilles becoming something not even human, animal-like. The reason for our work is that we want to preserve and understand the rich multiformity of the Iliad. We want to share in and invite everyone else who is interested in this wonderful text to share in the thousands of years of response to this poem, a poem that's timeless and always relevant. We don't want to have to force ourselves into the false decision of saying, what is the one Iliad? With the richness of this poem, we invite you to join with us in asking, how should we understand it today? For all of us, thank you for your attention. We would be happy to take questions. I know that's part of the plan here, so thank you for your interest today.
Terrific. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. We have one comment. Very interesting talk. The students are having a wonderful scholarly experience. That certainly is clear. Here's a question that's come up. What is the current thinking on how this oral poem was actually written down? It was substantially finished by the 6th century. How is it written down?
Sure, we do have historical testimony of versions as early as the 6th century. We know that there were many versions in many different places. And so one of the interesting things in the Scolia, we see the scholars like Xenodotus, like Aristarchus, whose names you heard briefly today, wrestling with the problem that they had many different Iliads. So they talk about, oh, here's what we read in the version from Massilia, that's Marseille today. Here's the version from the island of Chios. Oh, the sort of standard Athenian version has this. Xenonymous had these two different versions, and he didn't like this one, so he threw that one away and kept this one. There were many local circumstances that may have led to versions of the Iliad being written at different times and places. So it's not a single answer to a very reasonable question. When was it written down, though, sounds like we're asking about the Iliad. Our many Iliads were written down many times in many places.
That's wonderful. From Jim O'Hara for class of 81, who is at UNC Chapel Hill, his comment is that as a classicist, I'd like to note how remarkable and well-known is the work of Holy Cross undergraduates on the Scolia to Homer. I've been following this work from afar for years, and this is just amazing work for undergraduates to be doing. So kudos.
Yes.
And here's another question, this one from Kevin Quinn. How did the manuscripts you are studying end up in Venice and when?
That's a great question. So two of the manuscripts we're studying ended up in Venice. A couple of the other ones we're working with one that's in the British Library. We're working one that's in the Escorial Monastery in Spain. Probably all of them were written in Constantinople, which was such an intellectual center for centuries upon centuries. We do know specifically in the case of the manuscripts in St. Mark's Library in Venice, that they were the donation of a very famous scholar and by that time cardinal in the Roman Church, Vasilius Bessarion. Bessarion was Greek in origin, and he was part of the Orthodox embassy that came to Rome to try to negotiate kind of unification between the Orthodox and Roman Church. That failed. He wound up staying in Italy and converting to the Roman Church. He had a fantastic manuscript collection that he had assembled over years. And during his lifetime, he saw the encroaching Ottomans getting closer and closer to Constantinople, as it was to him. And so he saw a kind of his mission in life, in a sense, was to create a plant in the West somewhere, the sort of seeds of Greek culture. And he made the decision to donate to the Republic of Venice this manuscript collection of, I forget the number, well over 300 manuscripts that were a kind of core of the St. Mark's holdings in manuscripts. They included both the Venetus A manuscript that we talked about at some length, the Venetus B, another 11th century manuscript that our teams are studying this summer. We don't know really anything about their history earlier than Bessarion. So we have to fall back on the kinds of things that scholars do all the time. We study the form, we look at it, we compare it to other manuscripts where we do have better information and say, gee, this looks a lot like other 10th century manuscripts from Constantinople. That's an unfortunately typical situation.
Wonderful. Here's a question I was thinking as well from Dennis Fitzgerald. Will similar scholarly work be performed on Homer's Odyssey?
I hope so. My colleagues are young.
Great answer. Matthew, I might butcher his last name, Matthew R Akri, perhaps. Truly fascinating talk. Thank you. Do the Scolia elaborate or comment on the verbal connotations of the different manuscripts, or do they mainly point out the potential differences?
Great question. Any of my colleagues want to jump in with an example, feel free. One of the things that Scolia talk about a lot is, there are many different kinds of topics that Scolia talk about. And particularly in some of the manuscripts we're studying, they're not as concerned with the question of these editorial debates. What's the proper reading? Some of them are more focused on things like, okay, this is the true text. They thought of it the way that 19th century scholars in libraries thought of it, or the way that scholars in Alexandria thought of it. There was a given text. They were writing more for the reader to say, how do you understand this text, and explain away any potential problems. So they might address things like, oh, is this in character, or is this right in? So, and Catherine, did you want to say something about what you're reading this week with the Venetus B manuscript?
I was going to say, the scholiasts are really interested in everything. Of course, each scholar has their own area of focus, but really they look at all topics. Just yesterday, we read a scholia about Nestor, who is sort of the old advisor character in the Iliad. He's fought in many battles. The other characters, the Achaeans kind of are like, we should listen to him, but also like, should we listen to him? And in one scene, when they're on the battlefield, Diomedes is talking to Nestor, and the scholia points out how by Nestor's existence in this battle, it's truly showing what a brave character he is and how brave he is for being out there in the midst of this very intense battle that the Greeks are losing quite badly. And it kind of helps to highlight this by pointing to a character in the Odyssey, I'm forgetting his name, I think it's Philotoios, who is also an elderly man who exhibits incredible bravery. So it really adds to like the literary dimensions of these texts, and it really shows that these scholiasts were engaging with like all of the works they knew and all of the dominant literature of their period, and really expands our understanding, because I had never made that comparison myself.
That's terrific. Thank you. Michael Connolly asks, how does your analysis impact our understanding of rhapsodic competitions at the Athenian city Dionysia?
Dionysia, yes.
In the 5th century BCE, if the performance is not based on agreed upon text, how can a winner be determined?
Terrific question. So we know about these competitive performances that were in place in Athens by the 5th century. And indeed, they had agreed upon text. So in fact, there's a wonderful article on this by my colleague, Mary Abbott, in a sort of festschrift, a piece honoring my now emeritus colleague, but many of you in the room will know the name of Professor Blaise Nash. And in a collection of essays for Professor Nash, Professor Abbott contributed a piece on the names for parts of the Iliad that we know. So, oh, this section is called the embassy, or this section is called, what were we seeing the other day? Oh, this is the clipped battle, or the shortened battle is what the book 8 is called. And in Athens, you had to follow the Athenian version. So I didn't mean to imply that everyone was trying to get their own settled fixed version. They just didn't agree with each other. So the version of Chios, the version of Massilia, was not the same as the version of Athens. So we find in the later Alexandrian scholars' work that they know about the Athenian version, but they know others as well. So in your local context, there might be one true Iliad. And in the work of the librarians at Alexandria, they were trying to make all of these one true Iliads work together to get to their really one true Iliad. And in their debates, we really get to glimpse a little bit of what we've lost.
Exactly. Would one of you like to talk about the difference between the rosy-fingered and saffron dawn?
Fair question. Tuesday was a long time ago, but I'm sure you can remember.
That was in answer to the earlier question about the different types of scholia. We read a scholia earlier this week that Rose mentioned earlier in the talk about the difference between the saffron robe dawn, which is when it's mostly dark but a little bit light, and rosy fingered dawn, which is when it's mostly light but a little bit dark. And the scholiast really needed to convey that was what was happening, that it was mostly dark but a little bit light at this specific line of the Iliad. Just as another example that they're not always arguing over the one true Homer in the Scholia.
They're sometimes sort of giving you the kind of thing that maybe an English teacher would say as you're reading a text. They might be like, oh, well, this descriptive language. I'm going to explain why they've chosen this, word here, and kind of giving background that maybe when you're reading this in the 10th century and not in the context of ancient Greece, you might not understand because you're not quite as steeped and immersed in the culture. And so some of Homer's phrases and the traditions might go over your head. So the Scholiast is going to explain it to you because they want you to really get the full experience.
And from our point of view, those are both such common phrases. So rosy-fingered dawn, saffron-gowned dawn, they're examples of, in the work of Perry and Lord, where we see essentially the whole phrase as a unit. It basically just means dawn, but in this sort of metrical shape in this kind of place. So one of the great examples that trouble the Scholiast as well is of, well, why is Menelaus good at the war cry if he's just getting out of bed in the morning? He's not in battle. Why is he good at the war cry? Well, because this is the sort of principle that Perry and Lord talked about as the economy of the oral poet's language. The oral poet will have one expression in general, one expression for a concept in a kind of particular piece of the line, a particular metrical shape or a particular moment in the line. And so Menelaus will always be good at the war cry when he shows up at that position. And dawn will always be rosy-fingered when it shows up in that position, or conversely will always be saffron-gowned in this slightly different setting. But the Scholiasts didn't have any kind of concept of that, and they were trying to tease out these other nuances that are there. It's not, I'm not saying they're not there, but they have a different understanding we do. Yeah.
That's wonderful. As an early riser, I'm now going to know the distinction between these two dawns. I'll be thinking of you all tomorrow morning at 4:45. Let's see, we've got an interesting question here. Do your undergrads need a background in the Greek language?
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. They don't need a background to get started with the Homer Multitext Project. We've had students who started in their first semester of Greek. We've even had one student who started the semester before she was able to take Greek. There were tasks you could do to contribute to the project, but they're reading and working with this material in Greek. All of our majors study Greek. And I just like to add as a footnote that this is a challenging question in 2021. And at Holy Cross, we have made the decision that the way to be inclusive in our teaching of classics is to offer one major for everyone. And instead of trying to address all of the range of students who come into classics by having multiple tracks, we try to think, are there ways we can integrate everyone? And so we've been working this year as the first of a 3-year program in our Latin sequence to make first 3 semesters of Latin a very different kind of inclusive experience, including community-based and community-engaged learning. My new colleague, Catherine Sue, is helping to lead a kind of analogous program that we're hoping to introduce in Greek soon. So a long answer, perhaps to a simple question, but the answer is we're very deeply committed in making Greek and Latin accessible to everyone so that all of our majors can take part in this kind of work.
That's terrific. Here's a question from Alex Simro, class of 16. I love the fact that you're applying ideas from biology and genetics to study the transmission of these texts. This is a perfect example of why a liberal arts education is so special. Question for the students. What do you like most about working with these manuscripts, and what are some of the challenges you faced so far? Who'd like to go first?
I'll go first because I think I have an answer, so I'll buy some time for everyone else to sort of figure out how to articulate it. I think what I like is that you get to, when you're learning about classics, if you took Latin or Greek or some sort of mythology course in high school, or even as an undergraduate, there's a lot of focus on the classical world, and then it's and this is what we know now. And sometimes you kind of get lost of the path it gets there. How do we know these things? Where do these texts come from? What happened between, when this text was written and now we're, translating it in class. So what I like about looking at these manuscripts is that you kind of get to see people doing studying classics 1,000 years ago, and you're as far away from them as they were from you know, some of the people they were studying. And so I like that you get to see sort of a history of your discipline while also doing just really interesting work and asking interesting questions.
Yeah, I'll jump on that to continue to buy us some time. And I think maybe Augusta agrees with me on this. I was a STEM person in high school as well as a Latin person. Augusta is a chem major. I'm a psych major, in addition to being a classics major. And I really liked, what drew me first to Latin in high school was that it was a puzzle, and it worked my brain the same way that AP Chem worked my brain, the same way that my AP Calc class worked my brain. That's how I bought my way into college, was talking about that like connection in my interviews, about how, you know, they're very similar computationally in the puzzle of working with a language. And as I progressed in language learning, the puzzle kind of goes away as you focus more on fluidly reading Latin and fluidly reading Greek and seeing it less as a puzzle and more as a living language. And so I think working with the data side of this project and being really technical and looking at each piece and how it fits together in this grand puzzle that we're trying to piece together kind of connects me back to the original things that I loved about Latin and why I ultimately chose to do this as a major.
So jumping off of that, when I was applying to college, I also talked in my interviews about like how writing or debugging a computer program was very similar to translation in my mind. And yeah, that was something I really enjoyed joining the Homer Multitext project, because like that was something I got to experience. And in addition, I came into college not knowing any Greek. I took 4 semesters of Greek, just completed my 4th. And now this summer, I get to use my translation skills to actually see what these Scolia are saying. And in terms of challenges, to be honest, there are a lot of abbreviations in the Scolia that I have not memorized. So like every 5 minutes, I have to pull up this chart of like, okay, what does this abbreviation mean? What does this abbreviation mean? And yeah, Natalie's holding it right there. So that's my biggest challenge so far.
I really agree with everything everyone else has said. And now hearing you guys talk, I just realized that I'm the only person on this team who doesn't also have a science major. I'm just a gender studies minor, which is a little intimidating now to think about it. But I feel like I kind of love manuscripts for the same reason that everyone else does. Like classics is about this conversation that's constantly building on these ancient ideas and ancient concepts that we're always thinking about and engaging with in new ways. For example, even today, Madeline Miller's books are incredibly popular and they deal heavily with the Iliad and the Odyssey. But these manuscripts, they're a new part of this ancient conversation. And I love that we have the opportunity to really engage with and discover these things that no one has ever seen before. Like these Scolia we talked about, I would doubt that maybe more than 50 people or 50 or 100 people in like the history of since they were written down have ever read these. And we're probably the first people who are going to put them online so that everyone who wants to can read them. And I think we should put the link for the Homer Multitext project in the chat so you can see our beautiful Benedict's A. So I love that we're able to participate with these ancient things in an entirely new way. As for challenges, like Rosa said, the abbreviations, sometimes it feels like the scholiasts are kind of writing in their own little scholarly language that's perfectly intelligible to them, but is a little weird and confusing for us with their abbreviations and their compressions and their little grammar techniques. But it's fun learning that new language. And I think it's difficult, but it's worth it.
Yeah, as one of the on the team who's been a student longer than any of the others, I would say that for me, it's incredibly challenging moving to, I guess I did this about more than 10 years ago now, but moving into this kind of manuscript study and trying to read things like Scolia. I mean, and Catherine, I think, is exactly right in saying that they're like a different language. It doesn't matter that, it didn't matter that I already had a PhD in classics and had, read tons of Greek. Having to read Scolia was like starting on a new kind of Greek altogether. And in some ways, that's at that point, well, why not do it when you've done 4 semesters instead of, waiting for years and years? And it turns out to be possible. And the difficult stuff with just reading the manuscript is something that they're commenting on. But the fact is, all 4 of them do it with such facility and had got to that point so quickly that it's maybe hard for them to appreciate what, how quickly they've overcome all that. If you threw a page of this manuscript in front of someone like me, a classicist with a PhD, he's been teaching forever and had never looked at this before, it would look pretty mysterious, I think, to most people. So it's a new world, it's a new kind of evidence, but like as all the four of the others have said, it's really exciting to me to be able to look at this new kinds of material. I'd make one little maybe footnote on Anne-Catherine's comment too about things that haven't been previously published. The biggest edition of the Scolia of the Iliad, this quote unquote standard one that most people use, was done a 5-volume, 6-volume massive thing. And when we first started work on the Homer Multitext Project, editing these manuscripts, we thought, well, we'll index all our work to this big publication by Hartmut Erbst that everyone will be able to follow it. And we found out that about 80% of the content was not included in Erbst's edition. Now, he says he's only going to do the vetera, the ones that he thinks are the genuine, legitimate old ones, and he's not interested in certain categories. But I don't think many scholars recognize, or at least if they recognize, if they force themselves to stop and think about it, that the way they work with the previous editions don't really reflect the fact that we're throwing away a quarter of the evidence. And we're getting, I think, some interesting initial results trying to understand the Scolia using these genetic algorithms, in part because we're looking at the whole picture. And rather than throwing anything out, we're saying, what do we find if we consider the whole package?
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I see that we're approaching a close. I'd like to say that I want to thank the 4 students, Augusta and Anne-Catherine and Natalie and Rose. You're so impressive. And of course, to Professor Neel Smith, amazing. I'd like to close with a point that Paul Swarney sent in, because what you've done for me is dust off these cobwebs and bring this text back to life again for me. And Paul's comment is, going back to the comparison between Agon and Pharaon, is that Agon goes very well with Helen being given the last words over Hector, and where she notes his kindness. So Professor Smith, maybe you'd like to just say the final words, but I think that's just such a beautiful way to have you all understand what you've done for us today.
Thank you. I agree with the last commenter that I think the poetics of Ago are much more powerful in that last line. Personally, I'm very happy that that's the choice that the Venetus A scribe made. I'm with the Venetus A scribe on that one, and I love the fact that we're able to see all of that in the work we're doing.
Terrific. Thank you all so much for coming. Again, this has been hosted by the 1843 Legacy Society. If you're interested in learning more about the Society, we have a website, www.1843legacysociety.com. Excuse me, .org, of course, .org. So thank you so much for attending, and we encourage you to attend more sessions. Reunion weekend still running. Take care now.